Hi guys, in this tutorial we're going to be covering all of the key system settings and interface tools for Blender 3D. This is a perfect starting point if you are new to Blender and want to get to grips with the interface and how to change the core settings to prepare yourself to use Blender however you see fit. Keep an eye in the timestamps for the description as well as the comment section for links to other videos related to these tools and topics. When you open up Blender, you will be greeted with the splash screen in the center of the Blender UI. But while working on your project, if you need to return to the splash screen, all you should do is come up to the Blender logo in the top corner, left click and choose splash screen. From here you can view the current version, choose a new file template, or access recent files, or even open the file browser for an older project. To start a new file in Blender, go to File, New, and then choose from one of the existing templates. Each template will set up Blender for a specific workflow. For example, the video editing template will allow us to set up Blender for video editing specifically instead of 3D modeling. If we want the standard template, we would choose General. To open a recent file, go to File, then go to Open Recent. You should get a list of all of the most recent projects that you've been working on within Blender. The size of this list can be changed in the Preferences panel. By default, it will probably be around 10 projects long. To open an older project, go to File and then Open. Locate your project within your file browser, select it and then select Open. This is going to open that specific project. Let's say you started a project but forgot to save. Here I'm going to create a new project that is currently not saved, and I'm going to make a few changes to this project. Now I'm going to quit my Blender project, and then I'm going to open Blender up again. Even though I forgot to save my project, I can restore it by using the Recover Last Session option within the splash screen. If you miss it, you can go to File and from here go Recover Last Session. Left click and it will restore the project where you left off. Keep in mind this will only work so long as your computer remained on and you remained logged in between sessions. To save a new project, go to File and then choose Save As. Left click and then locate the area on your system where you would like to save your work. Come down to the bottom and give your project a name. I'm just going to name this as Work and press Enter. The .blend file extension, which is used for all Blender projects, is going to be added on automatically. Then click Save As and you've now saved your project to your computer. If you were to go to File, from here you can choose to create a copy of your save, create incremental saves that do not overwrite each other, or the traditional save option. For most of you, you're just going to use save from this point on once you have saved your project for the first time. To access your settings and preferences for your version of Blender, go to the Edit menu at the top, and from here go to the very bottom where it says Preferences. This will open up a new window from which you can manipulate many of the core settings relating to Blender itself. To change the text size within the interface, go to the Interface subsection of the Preferences panel. The very first option is for the resolution scale. This can go as high as 3 and as low as 0.5. By default, it should be set to 1. If I was to do this, the text elements on screen would look far too small. This is because I'm using a 27-inch 4K monitor. The resolution as well as the display size is going to determine the resolution scale that will be best for you. When I work, I normally use a value of 1.7, but when recording videos, I'll set it as high as 2. You can go, again, as high as a resolution value of 3, and as low as a value of 0.5. For most users though, this is going to be far too small, but you're going to want to experiment to see which size is right for your display and your resolution. To change the language of the Blender interface, go to the Interface subsection in the Preferences panel and scroll down to where it says Language. The first option here will allow you to translate to a different language. My default is English, which is my first language, but there are many languages in which you can choose. For example, we can choose Spanish. This will automatically transfer or translate the language of the entire interface from English to Spanish. There are a couple of exceptions depending on the chosen language. For example, here the Workspace tabs are still in English. That's just something to keep in mind when you're choosing the ideal language. Don't forget, we can always go back to our original, as it's very easy to spot since it will normally be in parentheses what the actual language is in that language. So here I've just transferred back to English. To set Blender up to use my GPU for rendering, go to the Preferences panel and then go to the System subsection. At the very top you'll have a section for Cycles Render Devices. By default this will be set to none. If you are using an older NVIDIA GPU, select CUDA. If you are using a newer NVIDIA GPU, select Optics. If you are using an AMD GPU, choose HIP. And if you are choosing to use an Intel GPU, choose one API. For me, because I'm using a 3080 from NVIDIA, I would choose the Optics for my rendering. To change the color theme of the Blender interface, go to the Themes subsection in the Preferences panel. At the very top, you can choose a preset. For me, I only have two options by default, Blender Dark and Blender Light. I can choose between these two, and this will alter how the entire interface appears. Alternatively, I can edit any of the individual elements of Blender's UI. For example, I can go into Outliner, and I can change the color of the selected objects. Now the outliner is this panel right here. So I can change, for example, the active object color to green, and you can see this change here in the outliner panel. If you want to save your new theme, come up here and click on the plus button, then give it a new name. I'm just going to call this one New Theme. Click OK, and then click on the Save Theme button. This can overwrite your custom theme if you make any changes to it. Note that this button will not work with the initial Blender Dark and Blender Light themes. These are fixed themes that cannot be changed. To export a file or an asset from Blender, go to File, then go to Export. You can determine the file format that you want to use. This will change depending on the asset's purpose. For example, if the asset is being used for video games, you would want to go with either the .obj or .fbx file formats. .obj is a relatively simple one to use, so for this example, we're going to use it. And here we can define the different parameters for our export. We can choose from different presets, but we first of all would need to create them using the plus button. So you would define the settings that you want to use, and then you would save it using the plus button here. Once you're ready to export, make sure you've given it a name, and then choose Export Wavefront OBJ. Now we're going to import this asset into a new project. Go to File, New, General, and I'm just going to delete the cube. Next, we're going to import by going File, Import, and then wavefront.obj. From here, we're going to find the correct location, choose export.obj, and choose import. When you are using an OBJ file, it will come with an MLT file as well. So you could choose both of them and import wavefront OBJ. This will allow you to import the asset into your new project. Workspaces are predefined layouts that focus on a specific workflow. The layout workspace, which we are currently using, is the default setup for Blender. If you want to focus specifically on modeling, you can choose the modeling workspace located here. You'll notice that many of the workspaces are available as tabs to access at the top of the Blender UI. Modeling can be used specifically for modeling objects. Sculpting adopts the sculpting workflow with brushes and other tools. UV editing is for taking our 3D objects and projecting them on 2D maps to prep for texturing. Each of these workspaces has its own use case within our workflow. You may use some, you may not use others, depending on your project's specifications. Each workspace is made up of a series of panels. These are very easy to identify. For example, we have the 3D viewport, the outliner, the properties, and a timeline. We can change the sizing of these panels on our display by hovering our mouse over an intersection until the mouse cursor changes. We can then click and drag to increase and decrease the size of adjacent panels. Because the display is always going to be the same size, whenever we increase the size of one panel, we are going to be decreasing the size of the adjacent panel. We can do this with all of the panels in our workspace, but this will not affect other workspaces that we have access to. So any editing of the panels is only done in the existing workspace. To change the editor type that is used in a specific panel, go to the top corner of that specific panel. The icon changes depending on the editor type currently in use, but the location of the menu will always be in the same place regardless of the panel. Left click on this icon, and this will take you to a menu from which you can choose a new editor type to use in that panel. For example, we can change the timeline to the graph editor. We could also change our outliner to a file browser. We can change all of these panels and their editor types at will. All we need to do is locate the menu in the top corner of that panel. For now, let's just revert back to the default setup. We can split and join our panels to increase and decrease the total number of panels on our display. For example, let's say we wanted to split our timeline here. We would hover over an intersection and right click. We then have the opportunity to join, swap, or split. Here we're going to do a vertical split, and we can hover our cursor over any panel that we wish. It's going to show us very clearly how the panel is going to be split. In this example, I'm going to go to about here and left click. Now we have two timelines, but I can take one of these timelines and change it to something different, such as a UV editor. Alternatively, I can open up this menu again by hovering over an intersection, right-clicking, and choosing the join options. Here, if I go join right, the timeline will overlap and delete the new panel that we recently created. Another alternative is to swap areas. So if we were to hover over this intersection, right-click, and swap areas, it would swap the timeline with our 3D viewport. We can right click and swap areas again to revert back to how it was before. You can create a new window by going to the window menu, opening it, and choose new window. This will open a new window in which you can use and reposition. This is particularly useful if you have multiple displays. So you can open a new window and position it on another monitor so that you can use Blender on multiple screens. Depending on the use case of Blender, we may want to change what template we're using. The template defines the workspaces that are available to us for that project. If we go to File and New, we have access to 5 different templates, each for its own project type. General, again, is used for creating 3D models. 2D animation allows us to animate in 2 dimensions. Sculpting is a more simplified form of the general workspace, but it is more specialized for the sculpting workflow. VFX is for creating special effects such as using motion capture and placing them into our animations and scenes. Video editing allows us to edit imported footage, whether that be from animations created in Blender or even external video files. For example, if we go to the video editing workspace, we have access to video editing and rendering. If we go to the 2D animation template, we have access to our 2D animation workspace, our full canvas workspace, compositing and rendering. So we have everything that we need for that specific project type within that template. In Blender, there are different object types that we can add to our scenes. If we go to Add and find Text, we can add a text object to our 3D scene. We can edit this object by going to the Data tab in the Properties panel. This allows us to define characteristics such as character spacing, word spacing, line spacing, offset, etc. But here we can also choose the font. But for this to work, we're going to need to provide Blender access to a font library. To define your font library, go to Edit and then Preferences. From here, we want to go down to the bottom and select File Paths. By default, your fonts directory may appear the same as your textures and sounds. If you're using Windows, you're going to want to direct it to your fonts library on Windows. To do this, just left click on the icon, and from your system, just locate the fonts folder. It should be within the system list here. Alternatively, you can just type in this text and it should take you to the appropriate folder. When you're ready, just click Accept. And at that point, you should now be able to direct Blender to the fonts on your operating system. For now, we can close this, and then we can open up a new font and choose from our library. For example, let's change to this font here, select Open Font, and now you can see the font of the text object has changed. Here we have a cube and we want to add an image texture to this cube. If we go to the Open Image option, it will just take us to our Documents page. But what if we had a location where we stored our textures? The easiest thing to do would be to define that location in the Preferences panel. Go to Edit and Preferences. Under Data in File Paths, go to Textures and click on the Open Browser button. Then locate the directory that you want to use for your textures. Click Accept. Now close the panel. Return to Image Textures in the Shading workspace and select the Open button. It will now take you to the folder that you directed in the Preferences panel. Simply select the texture you want, Open Image, and it will apply the image texture to that object. You can set up an output for rendering animations. To do this, go to the Properties panel and choose the Output tab. By default, this will be the temporary folder. You can open up the file browser and then you can determine where you want the project to be rendered. For example, I can select a renders folder that I created and click Accept. Now if I was to render an animation, the file format, whichever I may choose, whether it be an image, sequence, or a movie file, would be saved directly to the chosen output. Keep in mind that this does not work with single renders. If you were to render a single image, you would need to go to the Image menu, Save As, and define a location to save that image. This output setting does not affect single renders. It only affects the location of your animations. Blender can use what is known as an asset library to quickly access models from other projects. Go to the Edit menu and choose Preferences. Under File Paths, you will have the ability to create a user library. You can create as many of these as you wish. For example, I may want to create a new library from my Drive folder. I can choose Add Asset Library, and now the path here would go directly to my D drive. I can choose the import method, which is to either link, append, or to append and reuse data. The reuse data option is the default, and in most cases should be kept as is. To access your user library, make sure that you define the path, and then in Blender, switch one of your existing panels to the Asset Browser. From here, you'll be able to access all of the assets within the chosen library. It should by default direct to all libraries. You can change this to the current file, an Essentials library, or the other libraries that you would have created in the Preferences panel. FYI, to save an object as an asset, you would need to select the object, go to the Object menu, go to Asset, and select Mark as Asset. By default, this is going to be stored in the unassigned folder. A lot of the tools that you use in Blender will have associated shortcuts or keymaps to them. To access the Keymap library, go to the Edit menu and select Preferences. Then come down to where it says Keymap. From here, you will be able to access the entire library of every single shortcut in Blender. For example, within the 3D view, we can go to Object Mode Global, and we can preview all of the hotkeys associated with this specific mode in Blender. You can also create new hotkeys in this location as well. Simply define where you want to create a new hotkey and scroll down to the bottom of that given list. You should find an Add New button. Left click and it will be set to none. You can click on the arrow to open up that specific keyboard shortcut, and you can define what it's going to be. For example, we can define exactly what key is going to need to be pressed. Left click within the event and it should say press a key. I'm going to press a key on my mouse, button 5, and now that's going to be mapped to something in Blender. However, right now it's not actually assigned to anything. Let's say I wanted to use it to create a specific number of subdivisions. Let's say I wanted to subdivide twice. If I open this up, I will get the code set for this specific command. I can take this and use Ctrl and C to copy. Then I can come down here, left click, Ctrl and V to paste. Press enter, and now this is going to activate the subdivision. Below that, we have the number of levels that we can define. I'm going to set this to 2. Now, I'm going to close my Preferences panel, select my object, and press the hotkey. I've been able to successfully subdivide to a level of 2, and I was able to do that with a hotkey that I created from the Keymap library. Add-ons are a great way of improving the functionality of Blender. To enable an add-on, go to Edit, Preferences, and then Add-ons. There are many add-ons that are going to be enabled by default. Others that I recommend enabling include the Node Wrangler add-on, as well as the Rigify add-on. Note that when compared to previous versions of Blender, there aren't as many add-ons located here in this list. Older versions will have many more add-ons available. You can locate new add-ons and install them from a wide variety of locations on the internet. Many of the add-ons that used to be on this list, however, have been remarketed or redefined as extensions. You can access extensions within the same Preferences panel. Just go to the Get Extensions subsection. Rather than having a tick box, these extensions will require you to install them directly. For example, let's say if we wanted to install this extension here, all we would need to do is click on the Install button, and this should successfully install that specific extension. It should appear in the installed list at the top of the Extensions subsection. You can install as many of these as you wish, but keep in mind that you should experiment with each one to see how it affects Blender as a whole. Some of these extensions may overlap with each other in terms of functionality. You may not have all of the peripherals required to use Blender effectively. Fortunately, it has a way of emulating certain peripherals. If you go to the Preferences panel and then go to the Input subsection, you will be able to emulate the Numberpad on a keyboard as well as a 3-button mouse. By ticking the Emulate Numpad option, for example, the numbers found at the top of your keyboard above the letters will begin to act in the same way as the Numberpad would on a full-sized keyboard. Now this, of course, takes away some of the functionality that these numbers would have otherwise had. The recommendation is to have a full-size keyboard that has its own Numberpad, but if you don't and you like to use the functionality of the Numberpad, which basically allows you to manipulate the various views in the 3D viewport, then you can use this checkbox right here. Alternatively, you can use the 3-button mouse emulator. This is great for laptops, as all you would need to do is hold down the Alt key and then move on your touchpad to be able to navigate 3D space. It can also be used for things like zooming, as it's emulating the functionality of the middle mouse button. For safety, you can create saved versions so that Blender does not always overwrite your previous save if you need to go back to an earlier state of the project. To do this, go to the Save and Load subsection in the Preferences panel. Under Blend Files, you'll be able to define the number of recent files. This is what you would see if you go File and Open Recent. However, the one we're interested in is Save Versions. By default, this is set to 1. We can set this to any number we want. For example, we can set this to 3 and then close. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to save this project 3 times. So let's save as, and then we're going to save it as ball.blend. Save as, and now I'm going to make a couple of changes. Let's start by adding some additional subdivision. Make a save. And now let's make another one where we create a duplicate of the object and save again. So we have saved several times with this project. If we go and open the project, you'll notice that we only have access to the most recent one by default. However, if we go to the filter menu here, we can come down to where it says backup.blend files and enable this option. From here, we have ball.blend, ball.blend 1 and ball.blend 2. The higher the number, the further back the save was in our project. So if we choose ball.blend 2 and open, it takes us back to a state before we added the second subdivision. Finally, if you want to restore Blender back to its default state, you can go File, Defaults, and then choose Load Factory Settings. This will bring everything back to the default state. Now, it's not going to be permanent. You can see the effect here on the text in particular. All of the settings have been reverted back to the defaults. However, if we go File, New, and create a new project, everything seems to stay as it is. The same would apply if we were to open up a previous project. If, however, you were to close this instance of Blender entirely and reopen it, the original settings that you had before would be restored. This option to load factory settings should be used in conjunction with going to the Preferences panel, and at the very bottom corner, choose the Save Preferences option. If we was to close Blender and open it back up, then the settings would appear as they were before, with the larger text elements and so on.